The hardest betrayal is not hearing strangers doubt you. It is hearing your own mother decide you are no longer worth standing for. I used to imagine that if I ever earned the Silver Star, the first face I would search for in the crowd would be my mother's. Not because I needed applause. Not because I wanted recognition. I simply wanted to see pride replace the quiet disappointment that had lived in her eyes for almost 20 years. That morning, the ceremony hall at Fort Jefferson looked exactly the way every military tradition promised it would. Rows of polished chairs stretched beneath bright lights. American flags stood perfectly aligned beside the stage. Families whispered with excitement while cameras flashed from every corner of the room. Fellow soldiers greeted one another with firm handshakes, proud smiles, and the familiar warmth that only comes from people who have trusted each other through difficult days. My uniform had been pressed twice before sunrise. Every ribbon rested exactly where it belonged. The Silver Star presentation would begin in less than 15 minutes, yet my hands were calmer than they had been during any inspection I had ever faced. I had prepared myself for speeches, photographs, interviews, and congratulations. I had not prepared myself for my mother. Diane Carter arrived precisely on time, dressed in an elegant ivory pantsuit that looked more appropriate for a charity fundraiser than a military ceremony. Her blonde hair, now streaked with silver, was perfectly styled. She smiled politely at officers who welcomed her, thanked every volunteer with impeccable manners, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed appearances mattered above everything else. My father, Richard, walked beside her quietly, offering me a small smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. I crossed the lobby toward them with genuine hope. For one brief second, I believed today might finally be different. "Mom." I smiled. "I am really glad you came." She looked at me from head to toe, pausing for just a moment on the medals across my chest. There was no admiration in her expression. Only careful observation, as though she were evaluating a stranger wearing an unfamiliar costume. "You look healthy," she answered politely. "Thank you for inviting us." The distance in her voice hurt more than open anger ever could. Before I could continue, an event coordinator approached to remind me that recipients would line up backstage in 5 minutes. I nodded, but my mother gently touched my sleeve. "Rachel," she said. "May we have a private word?" Her voice remained soft enough that no one else noticed. I followed her into a quiet hallway beside the auditorium entrance. The sounds of laughter and conversation faded behind the closed doors. For several seconds she simply looked at me. I searched her face for encouragement, concern, even nervousness. Instead, she folded her hands together and took a slow breath. "Your father and I discussed today carefully," she began. "We decided we need to be honest with you." My heartbeat slowed in the strange way it sometimes did before receiving difficult news. "Honest about what?" She met my eyes without hesitation. "When everyone stands to honor you, we will remain seated." I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. "What?" "We cannot celebrate the choices that brought you here." Her words landed with astonishing calm, almost rehearsed. "This ceremony may mean everything to the Army, Rachel, but it does not change how we feel. We never wanted this life for you. We never believed this was the future you should have chosen." I could barely find my voice. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" "We came because declining the invitation would have created questions. But standing would mean approval. We cannot pretend." My throat tightened, yet years of military discipline kept my face still. "Mom, this is not about agreeing with every decision I have ever made. It is one ceremony." "No," she answered quietly. "It is about principles." She glanced toward the auditorium doors. "People may stand. They may applaud. They may admire what you have done. But your father and I will not stand with you." Behind her, I saw my father lower his eyes without speaking. His silence somehow hurt almost as much as her words. I wanted to ask why today still was not enough. I wanted to ask what achievement could possibly erase 2 decades of disappointment. I wanted to remind her of birthdays missed because of deployments, holidays celebrated through video calls, and every letter I had mailed home hoping for one sentence that simply said she was proud of me. Instead, I swallowed every question. Years had taught me that arguments never changed her mind. The coordinator opened the hallway door. "Captain Carter," she called gently. "They are ready for you." I nodded once. My mother stepped aside without another word. As I walked toward the stage entrance, I heard applause beginning inside the auditorium for another recipient. My breathing became steady again. Whatever happened next, I told myself one simple truth. I could not control who stood for me. I could only control how I stood for myself. Moments later, I joined the line of honorees waiting behind the curtain. An officer adjusted his uniform collar and whispered, "Your family must be incredibly proud today." I managed a small smile. I hope everyone finds something worth being proud of. The master of ceremonies began introducing recipients one by one. Each name drew warm applause from the audience. Then I heard my own name announced across the speakers. The curtain opened. Bright lights filled my vision as I stepped onto the stage. Instinctively, before looking anywhere else, my eyes searched the audience until they found the reserved family section. Hundreds of people were already rising to their feet. Everyone except two. I froze for only a fraction of a second, but it felt long enough for every camera in the room to capture exactly what my eyes had found. Hundreds of people stood with smiles, applause echoing through the auditorium like rolling thunder. My fellow officers rose. The families of complete strangers rose. The high school history teacher who had driven nearly 2 hours after receiving an invitation stood with tears in her eyes. Even the volunteers lining the back wall stood respectfully. Only 2 people remained seated in the reserved family section. My mother sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly across her lap as though she were attending a routine conference. My father remained beside her, his shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. He glanced toward me for only a moment before lowering his eyes again. The sight struck harder than I expected, but years of training quietly took over. I kept walking until I reached the center of the stage. The commanding general greeted me with a warm handshake. His smile never changed, yet I noticed his eyes briefly follow my gaze toward the audience before returning to me. If he had seen what happened, he was too professional to acknowledge it. The citation describing my service began to fill the room. I had heard those words several times during rehearsals, yet today they sounded strangely distant, as though someone were reading another person's story. I listened while standing perfectly still, reminding myself that this moment belonged not only to me but also to every soldier who had stood beside me during difficult days that never appeared on television or in newspaper headlines. The silver star was pinned carefully onto my uniform. The applause grew even louder. I saluted, accepted the certificate with steady hands, and thanked the general before stepping to the podium for a brief speech. As I looked across the audience, I realized something unexpected. Although my mother's decision still hurt, it no longer occupied every corner of my mind. The faces in front of me told another story. I saw pride, respect, gratitude, and genuine kindness from people who had no obligation to care about me. For years I had believed that one person's approval would finally make me feel complete. Standing there, I began wondering if I had been measuring my own worth with the wrong standard all along. I adjusted the microphone and smiled gently. "Thank you for being here today. Recognition is never earned alone. Every person wearing this uniform learns quickly that success belongs to teams, not individuals. Every lesson, every challenge, and every opportunity has been shaped by people willing to trust one another. I am grateful for every leader who expected more from me than I believed I could give, every teammate who reminded me to keep moving forward, and every family that has sacrificed quietly behind the scenes." I paused briefly, taking one slow breath before continuing. Some people spend years hoping to earn acceptance from those they love most. Eventually they discover that integrity cannot depend on another person's approval. We cannot choose every voice that speaks into our lives, but we can choose which values guide the lives we build. Complete silence settled across the auditorium for several seconds before another wave of applause erupted. I never looked directly at my mother while speaking, yet I knew she understood exactly what those words meant. When I stepped away from the podium, I caught a brief glimpse of her expression. For the first time that morning, she did not appear completely certain of herself. It lasted only an instant before her familiar composure returned. As the ceremony continued for the remaining recipients, I returned to my seat beside several fellow officers. Captain Melissa Grant leaned toward me with a warm smile. "That speech was beautiful," she whispered. "You probably inspired more people than you realize." "Thank you," I replied quietly. She hesitated before asking, "Are you doing all right?" I recognized kindness when I heard it, but I also knew she had noticed my family's reaction. There was no reason to pretend otherwise. "I will be," I answered honestly. She gave my shoulder a reassuring pat before facing the stage again. Nearly 40 minutes later, the formal ceremony concluded. Guests began gathering in the reception hall where light refreshments had been arranged beneath rows of American flags and framed photographs honoring military service through the decades. Reporters interviewed several recipients while families exchanged congratulations. Everywhere I turned, someone offered a handshake, a smile, or sincere words of appreciation. Yet despite the warmth surrounding me, one question quietly lingered in my thoughts. Would my mother leave without saying another word? Before I could decide whether to approach her, an elderly woman carrying a small leather handbag stopped directly in front of me. Her eyes were already filled with tears. She held my hands gently as though she had known me for years. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I have wanted to meet you for a very long time." I searched my memory but could not place her face. "I am sorry," I admitted softly. "Have we met before?" She smiled through her tears and slowly shook her head. "No. But because of you, someone very important to me came home." My heartbeat slowed. Before I could ask another question, I noticed my mother standing only a few feet away. She had stopped walking toward the exit. For the first time since arriving that morning, she was listening instead of speaking. The elderly woman held my hands with surprising strength, as though she had carried this conversation in her heart for years. Around us, the reception hall continued buzzing with conversations, laughter, and congratulations, yet everything else seemed to fade into the background. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said softly. "My son is Sergeant Andrew Ellis." The name reached into my memory immediately. I smiled before I could stop myself. "Andrew. Of course. How is he doing?" Fresh tears filled her eyes, but this time they carried relief instead of sorrow. "He is home. He coaches Little League every Saturday. His daughter just turned 6 last month. She insisted on baking cookies this morning because she heard I was finally meeting the woman she calls Grandpa's hero." She reached into her handbag and carefully removed a small envelope. Inside were several photographs. One showed Andrew standing in a backyard beside a smiling little girl holding a baseball glove nearly as large as she was. Another showed an ordinary family gathered around a dining table filled with birthday decorations. There were balloons, paper hats, and a homemade cake with uneven frosting that could only have been decorated by children. Margaret gently touched the photograph with one finger. "Every birthday she celebrates exists because my son came home. Every Thanksgiving. Every Christmas morning. Every ordinary Tuesday evening when they eat dinner together. Those moments matter because someone refused to give up on him." I looked at the pictures for several quiet seconds before returning them carefully. "Andrew did the hard part," I replied. "He worked incredibly hard afterward. He earned every one of those moments." Margaret smiled kindly. "That sounds exactly like what he told us you would say." Behind her, I noticed my mother had not walked away. She remained standing several feet behind Margaret, pretending to examine one of the historical displays along the wall while listening to every word. She still refused to meet my eyes. Margaret continued speaking, completely unaware of the silent audience behind her. "My son never speaks about difficult days in detail. He believes some memories belong only to the people who lived them. But one thing he has repeated many times is this. He said there was one officer who stayed calm when everyone else felt overwhelmed. He said she reminded people to think clearly instead of giving in to fear. He said leadership is not about being the loudest person in the room. It is about helping everyone else believe tomorrow is still possible. I felt my face grow warm with embarrassment. Praise had always made me uncomfortable, especially when it came from people who had experienced far greater challenges than I ever could explain. He gives me too much credit, I answered quietly. Margaret shook her head. Mothers know when their children exaggerate. Andrew never exaggerated when he talked about you. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to glance toward my own mother. Diane still stood perfectly still. The confidence that had filled her face in the hallway earlier that morning had softened into something more complicated. She was no longer looking at my medals. She was looking at the smiling child in one of Margaret's photographs. The expression lasted only a heartbeat before she straightened her shoulders again. A volunteer approached carrying a tray of coffee and refreshments. Margaret accepted a cup before thanking me once more. As she prepared to leave, she paused. There is something else you should know. Her voice became quieter. Andrew wanted to be here today himself. He requested leave weeks ago. I frowned slightly. Then why is he not here? Because another young soldier in his unit had an unexpected family emergency yesterday. Andrew volunteered to cover the assignment so that man could go home instead. I laughed softly despite the emotion in my chest. That sounds exactly like Andrew. He learned from someone, Margaret replied with a knowing smile before walking away. I stood there watching her disappear into the crowd, feeling an unexpected mixture of gratitude and humility. Sometimes the greatest compliment was seeing kindness continue long after your own part in the story had ended. Before I could gather my thoughts, Colonel Benjamin Hayes approached with 2 local reporters following a respectful distance behind him. Captain Carter, he said warmly, excellent ceremony today. The press would appreciate a few minutes if you are available. I nodded. During the interview, every question focused on teamwork, leadership, and service. I answered each one by speaking about the people around me rather than myself. When one reporter asked what receiving the Silver Star meant personally, I smiled and answered honestly. Awards recognize a moment. Character is built during all the ordinary days before and after that moment. I hope I continue earning the trust of the people I serve every single day. The interview ended with polite handshakes. As the reporters packed their equipment, my father slowly walked toward me alone. His steps were hesitant, almost uncertain. He looked older than he had that morning. Rachel, he began quietly. I waited patiently. He opened his mouth as though preparing to say something important, then glanced over his shoulder toward my mother. Whatever courage he had gathered seemed to disappear. Congratulations, he said instead. You gave a very thoughtful speech. Thank you, Dad. Another uncomfortable silence settled between us. He nodded once before turning away to rejoin my mother. I watched him leave, wondering how many years of unspoken conversations could fit inside a single sentence that was never spoken aloud. Just then my military phone vibrated against my uniform. I glanced at the secure notification on the screen. Immediate deployment support requested. Transportation departing in 30 minutes. I quietly slipped the phone back into my pocket before anyone else noticed. I had planned to spend the afternoon trying one last time to bridge the distance between my mother and me. Instead, duty had just rewritten the rest of the day, and I had no idea that my departure would soon force my mother to confront a truth she had spent 20 years refusing to see. I quietly excused myself from the reception and walked toward the operations office at the far end of the headquarters building. The celebration continued behind me with music, conversations, and the familiar sound of families taking photographs together, yet each step carried me farther away from the moment everyone else believed would become the happiest memory of my career. Inside the office, Major Linda Brooks was already reviewing several documents on a secure screen. She looked up the moment I entered. I was hoping the notification reached you after the ceremony, she said with an apologetic smile. I am sorry to interrupt today. What happened? I asked. Nothing dangerous, she replied immediately, recognizing the question in my expression. A neighboring state requested experienced logistics officers to coordinate emergency support after severe storms disrupted several communities. They need people who can organize transportation, temporary shelters, and supply distribution. Your leadership record made you an obvious choice. Relief quietly settled into my chest. The assignment would require long hours and quick decisions, but it was exactly the kind of work that reminded me why I had chosen this life years ago. When do we leave? Transportation departs in 30 minutes. I nodded without hesitation. I will be ready. As I signed the deployment paperwork, Major Brooks paused before handing me the final page. One more thing, she said. I watched your speech today. I smiled politely. Thank you. She studied me for a moment. You carried yourself with remarkable grace. She did not mention my parents directly, but she did not have to. Military communities were observant. They understood silence almost as well as words. Some days, I answered quietly, professionalism is simply choosing not to let personal disappointment become someone else's burden. She gave a slow nod that told me she understood completely. 20 minutes later I returned briefly to the reception hall to collect my dress cap and overnight bag. Most guests were still talking in small groups. My mother and father stood near one of the display tables where the ceremony program booklets had been arranged. I considered walking over one final time, but before I could move, another family stopped me to introduce their teenage daughter, who dreamed of attending West Point someday. The young woman asked thoughtful questions about leadership, discipline, and balancing responsibility with compassion. We spoke for several minutes, and by the time the conversation ended, my parents had already started walking toward the parking lot. I watched them leave through the glass entrance without calling after them. For years I had believed every difficult conversation had to happen immediately before another opportunity disappeared. Age had slowly taught me something different. Sometimes forcing a conversation only pushed people farther apart. Sometimes time accomplished what arguments never could. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across rows of parked vehicles as I loaded my overnight bag into the military transport van. Just before climbing inside, my phone buzzed again. It was a short text from my father. Congratulations again. Please travel safely. I stared at the message for several seconds before replying. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it. I almost added another sentence asking him to tell Mom goodbye for me, but I stopped myself. If she wanted to speak, she knew exactly where I was. The convoy departed the installation less than 10 minutes later. As the building slowly disappeared behind us, I leaned my head against the window and allowed myself one quiet breath. The ceremony was over. The disappointment remained, but surprisingly, it no longer felt as heavy as it had that morning. Margaret's photographs kept returning to my thoughts. A little girl smiling beside her father. A family sharing an ordinary birthday. Small moments that mattered far more than medals ever could. Somewhere along the road I realized that my mother's refusal to stand had not erased the lives my work had quietly touched. That truth brought an unexpected sense of peace. Meanwhile, nearly an hour after leaving the base, my parents arrived home. The drive had been unusually quiet. My father finally broke the silence. Margaret seemed grateful. My mother kept her eyes on the road ahead. She was emotional. Would you not be? He asked gently. Diane did not answer. After entering the house, she placed her purse on the kitchen counter and absent-mindedly emptied its contents. Her car keys, reading glasses, and the folded ceremony program slid onto the granite surface. She reached for the booklet almost automatically. Earlier that morning she had barely glanced at it before slipping it into her handbag. Now, with the house completely silent, she opened the first page. The program contained more than the schedule. There was a letter from the commanding general describing the values represented by each recipient. There were personal statements submitted by fellow service members explaining why each honoree had been nominated. There were short messages from families whose lives had been positively affected through military support operations across the country. Diane turned another page and stopped. Beneath my photograph appeared a paragraph she had never expected to read. It was not written by an officer. It was written by one of my junior soldiers. He described how I quietly visited hospitalized team members during holidays so that no one would spend Thanksgiving or Christmas feeling forgotten. He wrote that I remembered birthdays, learned the names of spouses and children, and never asked anyone to do a task I was unwilling to do myself. Diane continued reading. Another page included comments from community leaders thanking military volunteers for organizing emergency relief after flooding the previous spring. My name appeared several times. There were no dramatic stories. No grand speeches. Just repeated examples of ordinary kindness carried out over many years. Halfway through the booklet, a single handwritten note slipped onto the kitchen counter. It had been tucked inside without my knowledge by the event organizers. Diane slowly picked it up and unfolded the paper. The first line immediately caused her expression to change, because the message had not been written for the audience. It had been written by someone whose life our family had never met until today. My mother unfolded the handwritten note with the casual curiosity of someone expecting another formal thank you message. Instead, the first sentence forced her to sit down at the kitchen table before she had even reached the second line. Dear Captain Rachel Carter, my children still believe heroes wear capes. Someday I will tell them that the greatest hero I have ever met wore an army uniform and smiled while telling frightened people that everything would be all right. The note was signed by Emily Sanders, a school principal whose town had been devastated by severe flooding the previous spring. My mother continued reading slowly. Emily described how military volunteers had arrived before sunrise, helping coordinate temporary shelters, organize deliveries of food and medicine, and comfort families who had lost access to their homes. She wrote that while television cameras focused on large equipment and official briefings, Rachel had spent nearly an hour sitting on the floor of an elementary school gymnasium reading children's books because frightened students needed someone calm more than they needed another speech. Emily ended her letter with a sentence that lingered long after the page had been lowered. Please thank the people who raised you, because kindness like hers begins long before anyone wears a uniform. Diane stared at those words without moving. They felt undeserved. She quietly whispered them again to herself. Thank the people who raised you. Richard noticed the change in her expression as he entered the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her without saying anything. After several moments he finally asked, "What did the letter say?" She handed it across the table. He read every word in silence before folding it carefully. Rachel never told us about any of this, he said. Diane slowly shook her head. She never tells us anything. Richard looked at her gently. Or perhaps she stopped believing we wanted to hear it. The sentence settled over the room like unexpected rain. Diane wanted to argue, but every response she considered felt incomplete. Memories she had not visited in years quietly surfaced. Rachel at 17, excitedly explaining why she wanted to serve instead of attending law school immediately. Rachel calling from officer training, sounding exhausted but hopeful. Rachel mailing holiday cards every December whether anyone answered or not. Rachel inviting them to promotion ceremonies they politely declined because they claimed military life was never really theirs. Each memory now carried a question Diane had avoided asking herself for 2 decades. Had she been protecting her daughter from disappointment, or had she simply been disappointed that her daughter refused to become the person she imagined? Hours passed almost unnoticed. The ceremony booklet remained open beside the handwritten note while late afternoon sunlight slowly crossed the kitchen floor. Finally Diane reached for her phone. She selected Rachel's contact and pressed call. It rang several times before transferring to voicemail. Diane ended the call without leaving a message. She is probably traveling, Richard said quietly. Diane nodded and called again anyway. the result was exactly the same. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, I sat inside a temporary coordination center established in a county emergency management building. Maps covered nearly every wall. Volunteers moved quickly between tables while local officials reviewed transportation schedules and shelter capacities. My military phone remained inside my bag on silent mode as we worked through assignment briefings. During the first break, Captain Melissa Grant walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. "Long day already," she said with a tired smile. "Long but meaningful," I answered. She glanced toward my packed gear. "Did your family get to congratulate you before we left?" I hesitated for only a second. "Not exactly." Melissa did not press for details. She simply smiled with quiet understanding. "Sometimes the family we choose reminds us of the family we wish we had." Her words stayed with me long after she returned to the planning table. Back at home, Diane called again. Then again. Then she tried sending a short message. "Are you all right? Please call me when you can." Minutes passed with no reply. She opened social media, hoping to see whether the base had posted photographs from the ceremony. Instead, she found dozens of comments beneath the official announcement celebrating Rachel's recognition. Former soldiers, volunteers, teachers, nurses, and complete strangers thanked her for encouragement they had received years earlier. Several people shared stories Diane had never heard before. None of them described dramatic moments. They described phone calls Rachel made to check on injured teammates months after they returned home. They described birthday cards sent to children whose parents were deployed. They described simple conversations that helped someone believe they could keep moving forward during difficult seasons. Diane felt something inside her begin to crack. The image she had defended for so many years no longer matched the daughter the rest of the world seemed to know. She picked up her phone once more and pressed Rachel's number. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Richard quietly looked at the growing list on the screen before asking, "How many times have you tried?" Diane counted silently before answering. I stopped keeping track. Richard gently placed his hand over hers. "When she finally sees those calls, she will know something changed." Diane looked toward the window as evening settled outside. For the first time in 20 years, she realized she no longer cared whether Rachel became the daughter she had imagined. She only wanted another chance to tell her she had never truly stopped being her daughter. At that exact moment, inside the busy emergency operations center, my phone remained untouched inside my bag while another vibration illuminated the dark screen, adding yet another missed call to a number that neither of us could have imagined would keep climbing through the night. I did not notice my phone vibrating once. I did not notice it vibrating 10 times. By the time the emergency coordination meeting entered its 3rd hour, the device remained zipped inside my overnight bag in a quiet corner of the operations center while my attention stayed fixed on maps, logistics schedules, and the constantly changing needs of several communities recovering from severe storms. Temporary shelters needed additional blankets before temperatures dropped overnight. A nursing home required transportation for residents whose backup generators had failed. Volunteers were arriving faster than supplies in some locations and slower than expected in others. Every decision depended on another decision. Every conversation affected someone waiting for help. There was no room to think about anything beyond the next task. Captain Melissa Grant joined me at a large planning table where county officials had spread dozens of printed maps across the surface. "We finally confirmed the last transportation route," she said, pointing toward a highlighted section. "If everything stays on schedule, every shelter should receive deliveries before midnight." I smiled with quiet relief. Good. That gives families one less thing to worry about tonight. A local emergency manager overheard the comment and nodded appreciatively. "Your team has brought remarkable organization into a situation that felt overwhelming this morning," he said. "People notice leadership like this." I thanked him politely, but inside I remembered something my first commanding officer had told me years earlier. Real leadership often became invisible because it existed to make everyone else successful. If no one noticed the effort, that usually meant the system was working exactly as intended. Back home, however, my mother had entered an entirely different kind of crisis. She sat alone in the family room surrounded by ceremony photographs that local newspapers had already begun posting online. Every image seemed to reveal something she had refused to see while sitting only a few yards away from the stage. Rachel smiling warmly at fellow recipients. Rachel shaking hands with junior soldiers before greeting senior officers. Rachel stopping repeatedly to speak with volunteers, custodians, and administrative staff instead of focusing on reporters. Comment after comment praised not only my service but also my character. One message from a retired colonel stood out above the others. Captain Carter has always believed respect should travel in every direction, not only up the chain of command. That quality cannot be taught in a single leadership course. It reflects years of personal integrity. Diane read the sentence several times before quietly placing the phone on the coffee table. Richard sat across from her without interrupting the silence. Finally she whispered, "I spent the entire ceremony looking for reasons to justify staying seated." Richard looked at her gently. "And what did you find?" She lowered her eyes. "Nothing that feels important anymore." Another wave of regret settled over her as memories continued surfacing one after another. She remembered Rachel mailing photographs from officer training with handwritten notes describing new friendships. She remembered ignoring invitations to promotion ceremonies because attending felt like encouraging a future she never accepted. She remembered politely changing the subject every time neighbors asked how Rachel was doing because discussing military life made her uncomfortable. None of those moments had seemed significant individually. Together they formed a pattern she could no longer deny. She had not simply disagreed with her daughter's career. She had gradually withdrawn from her daughter's life. Without another word, Diane picked up her phone again and pressed my number. The call reached voicemail. This time she did not hang up immediately. After several deep breaths she finally spoke. "Rachel. I do not know when you will hear this. I only know I should have said these things years ago instead of today. I thought refusing to support your career would eventually convince you to choose another path. Instead, all I accomplished was making you walk that path without your mother beside you. I cannot change this morning. I cannot change the years before it. But if you are willing, I would like the chance to begin changing tomorrow." Her voice trembled before she quietly ended the message. Richard reached over and gently squeezed her hand. Neither of them noticed the call log continuing to grow as she tried reaching me again throughout the evening. Meanwhile, the operations center slowly transitioned into night shift. Volunteers rotated through brief meal breaks while fresh weather reports appeared on large digital displays. Around 9 o'clock, Melissa approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You have not stopped moving since we arrived," she said. "Take 5 minutes." I accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. We stepped outside the building where the evening air felt noticeably cooler after the long day indoors. Several utility trucks passed along the highway while distant emergency vehicles continued responding throughout the county. Melissa looked toward the dark horizon before speaking. "Do you ever wonder why some people have such a hard time accepting kindness from the people closest to them?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed softly. "That is oddly specific." She smiled. "Occupational hazard. You notice things after enough years working with people." I looked down at the coffee cup in my hands. Sometimes expectations become heavier than relationships. People become so attached to who they hoped someone would become that they stop seeing who that person already is. Melissa nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like experience talking." Before I could answer, my radio signaled another briefing request. The short break ended as quickly as it had begun. I placed the untouched coffee on a nearby bench and returned inside without realizing my phone was still resting silently inside my bag. Near midnight, after nearly 16 continuous hours of work beginning with the ceremony that morning, I finally walked toward the temporary sleeping quarters prepared for military personnel. I reached into my bag looking for a notebook to review the next day's schedule. Instead, my fingers brushed against my phone. The dark screen suddenly illuminated as I pressed the power button, and for a long moment I simply stared without moving because the notification count filling the display was unlike anything I had ever seen before. I unlocked my phone expecting a handful of routine notifications from work. Instead, the screen filled with alerts that continued scrolling even after I dismissed the first page. 50 missed calls. 38 text messages. 9 voicemail notifications. Every single one came from either my mother or my father. I stared at the display for several long seconds, genuinely wondering whether there had been a family emergency. My heartbeat quickened as I immediately called my father first. The call connected after only one ring. "Rachel," he answered with obvious relief. "Thank goodness." "Dad, what happened? Is everything all right? Is Mom okay?" There was a brief silence before he replied. "We are all right. Your mother, she has simply been trying to reach you all day." I frowned in confusion. "Trying to reach me about what?" His voice became noticeably softer. "I think it is something she needs to tell you herself." Before I could ask another question, I heard my mother speaking in the background. A moment later my father quietly said, "She is not ready yet. Please call us tomorrow when you have time. I only wanted you to know everyone is safe." We exchanged goodnight, and the call ended. I remained seated on the edge of the narrow bunk, looking once again at the long list of unanswered messages. Curiosity slowly replaced the anxiety I had felt moments earlier. I opened the oldest text first. "Rachel, please let me know you arrived safely." The next one appeared 20 minutes later. "I am sorry I kept calling. I only wanted to know you were all right." Another message followed. "I should have said congratulations before you left." Then another. "I have been thinking about today all afternoon." I reached the final message sent just before midnight. "I am proud that you came home safely every time you wore that uniform. I wish I had told you sooner." I quietly set the phone beside me without opening the voicemails. Those few sentences alone had already shifted something inside me. Not because they erased the pain of that morning. They could not. Some moments permanently changed the shape of a relationship. But they revealed something I had stopped believing was possible. My mother was no longer defending her decision. She was questioning it. There was an important difference between those two things. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Captain Melissa Grant stood in the doorway carrying a folder. "Sorry to bother you this late," she said. "Tomorrow's assignments." She noticed my expression almost immediately. "Everything all right?" I smiled faintly. "I honestly do not know yet." She waited without speaking, giving me the space to continue if I wanted. After a moment I quietly admitted, "My mother called 50 times today." Melissa's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "That does not sound like someone who wants to stay distant." "No," I agreed thoughtfully. "It sounds like someone who suddenly realized what distance feels like." Melissa smiled gently. "Sometimes people need one unforgettable day to understand what years of ordinary conversations never taught them." After she left, I finally listened to the first voicemail. My mother's voice sounded completely different from the confident tone she had used in the hallway before the ceremony. She spoke slowly, searching for words instead of delivering conclusions. "Rachel, I know you may not want to hear my voice tonight, and I would understand if you deleted this message. I only wanted to tell you that I read the ceremony booklet after we came home. I met people today who know a version of my daughter that I never allowed myself to see. That is my failure, not yours." She paused for several seconds before continuing. "I thought refusing to support your career meant I was protecting the future I wanted for you. Instead, I spent years pushing away the future you were actually building. I am sorry." When the message ended, I remained completely still. I did not cry. I did not smile. I simply allowed the words to settle naturally, resisting the temptation to decide immediately whether they were enough. Forgiveness had never been difficult for me. Trust was different. Trust usually returned one quiet step at a time. The next morning began before sunrise. Our team resumed coordinating shelter operations, volunteer schedules, and transportation requests. The work demanded complete focus, yet every so often my thoughts returned to the phone resting inside my pocket. Around lunchtime, while reviewing supply deliveries with local officials, I noticed an elderly volunteer struggling to carry several heavy storage boxes alone. Before I could move, 3 younger volunteers immediately walked over and helped without being asked. The older woman smiled warmly and said, "Thank you. We stand together around here." The simple sentence caught me off guard. We stand together. Only 24 hours earlier my mother had promised she would never stand with me. Now, for reasons I still did not fully understand, she seemed determined to spend every waking hour reaching back across the distance she had created herself. That evening, after the final briefing ended, I stepped outside with my phone and found a quiet bench overlooking the temporary shelter parking area. Children laughed nearby while volunteers distributed evening meals to families preparing for another night away from home. Life continued moving forward despite disappointment, despite storms, despite regrets. I opened my contacts and rested my thumb over my mother's name. For several seconds I hesitated. Some conversations changed everything. Others only reopened old wounds. I took one slow breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before my mother answered, but instead of speaking immediately, all I heard on the other end was the unmistakable sound of someone quietly crying. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The only sound traveling through the phone was my mother's unsteady breathing as she struggled to regain control of her emotions. I had imagined this conversation many different ways over the years. In every version, I expected explanations, excuses, or another attempt to convince me that my choices had been mistakes. I had never imagined silence would be the first thing we shared. Finally she whispered, "Thank you for calling." Her voice was so quiet I almost did not recognize it. "Dad said everything was all right," I answered gently. I wanted to make sure that was true. "Physically, yes," she replied. "Emotionally, I have been trying to understand how I could sit there yesterday and believe I was doing the right thing." I looked across the parking area where volunteers were helping children carry board games into the temporary shelter for the evening. The ordinary kindness unfolding in front of me somehow made the conversation feel even more honest. "Mom," I said carefully, "you do not have to solve everything tonight." "No," she answered immediately. "But I have to start telling the truth tonight." She took a slow breath before continuing. "Rachel, I spent years telling myself I was protecting you. I convinced myself that if I refused to support your career, eventually you would choose a safer life. Every birthday I missed, every ceremony I skipped, every invitation I declined, I labeled it as tough love." Her voice cracked again. "Yesterday I finally realized it was not love you felt. It was rejection." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Hearing her say the word herself carried a weight that no accusation ever could. "It did feel that way," I admitted quietly. "I know," she whispered. "I know now." Another silence settled between us, but this one felt different. It was not filled with distance. It was filled with reflection. My mother spoke again before I could respond. "Do you remember your high school graduation?" I smiled faintly. "Of course. When everyone asked what you wanted to become, you said you wanted your life to matter to people you would probably never meet. I laughed afterward because I thought you were being dramatic." She paused. "Yesterday I met people whose lives were changed by the daughter I refused to understand. They knew you better than I did." Those words landed deeper than any apology. They revealed not only regret but also humility. For the first time, my mother was no longer speaking from certainty. She was speaking from discovery. After several more minutes she quietly asked, "Can I tell you something that I have never admitted to anyone?" "Yes." "I kept every letter you ever mailed home." I frowned slightly. "Every letter?" Every single one. I never threw them away. She gave a small, embarrassed laugh through her tears. I even kept the drawings you made in elementary school when you insisted on sketching yourself wearing a military uniform after your grandfather told you stories about serving. That surprised me more than anything else she had said. I thought you hated those drawings. I hated what I believed they represented, she answered honestly. I never hated the little girl who drew them. Her words unlocked a memory I had buried years ago. I remembered proudly taping one of those drawings to the refrigerator. A week later it had quietly disappeared. I assumed she had thrown it away because she disliked the idea. You still have it? I asked. Yes. Why? Her answer came almost immediately. Because even when I disagreed with your dream, I never stopped loving the little girl who dreamed it. I simply failed to understand that she grew into the same person. I felt something inside me soften. Not disappear. Not completely heal. But soften enough to let compassion enter where only disappointment had existed the day before. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. There were no dramatic speeches and no impossible promises. She apologized without asking me to erase the past. I listened without pretending the past had not hurt. We both allowed the truth to exist without competing over whose pain mattered more. Before ending the call she quietly asked, "When you come home, would you be willing to visit us?" I considered the question carefully. Trust deserved honest answers. Yes, I said. But I do not think we should pretend yesterday never happened. Neither do I, she replied. I think we should remember it for the rest of our lives. After the call ended, I remained seated beneath the evening sky for several minutes. I realized forgiveness was not a finish line someone crossed after hearing the perfect apology. It was a decision renewed through consistent actions over time. My mother had taken the first difficult step. Whether we could rebuild everything else remained unknown. 3 days later our emergency assignment concluded successfully, and our convoy returned to Fort Jefferson. Before leaving the base, I found a small package waiting inside my office with no return address written on the outside. Attached to the top was a handwritten note in my mother's familiar handwriting. It contained only one sentence. I think it is finally time for you to have something that should never have been hidden from you. I carefully opened the box, and the first item resting inside instantly brought tears to my eyes because it was the very drawing I believed had disappeared forever. The drawing rested in my hands with faded crayon colors and carefully folded edges that revealed how many years it had been stored. I recognized it instantly. A little girl wearing an oversized green military uniform stood beside an American flag almost twice her height. The proportions were impossible, the coloring wandered outside every line, and in the upper corner I had written in uneven block letters, "When I grow up I want to help people." On the back, in my mother's handwriting, was a date from nearly 25 years earlier. Beneath it she had added something I had never seen before. Rachel drew this after talking with Grandpa. She looked so happy. I read the sentence several times before noticing another envelope beneath the drawing. Inside were dozens of letters I had mailed home throughout my career, each one carefully organized with the original envelope still attached. None had been thrown away. None had been damaged. Some still carried small notes written in pencil by my mother after she received them. Read twice. Could not stop thinking about this. Wish she would come home soon. I sat quietly in my office, realizing that love and understanding had traveled separately through our family for far too many years. She had loved me more than I knew. She had understood me far less than either of us realized. A week later, after finishing several reports and returning to a normal schedule, I drove to my parents' house on a calm Saturday afternoon. I had imagined this visit repeatedly during the previous days, yet nothing prepared me for how ordinary everything looked. The flower beds were freshly trimmed. The old porch swing still creaked gently in the breeze. The same wind chime my grandfather had installed years earlier continued singing softly above the front steps. My mother opened the door. Before I reached it, for a brief moment we simply looked at one another. Neither of us seemed interested in pretending the past had disappeared. Then she stepped aside and quietly said, "Welcome home." The words carried a meaning they had not held in many years. Inside the living room, a small wooden box rested on the coffee table. My mother gently pushed it toward me. "There is one more thing." I opened the lid and found newspaper clippings from nearly every milestone of my career, promotion announcements, photographs printed from military newsletters, and community articles mentioning volunteer projects. Every item had been carefully dated. "You kept all of this?" I asked softly. She nodded. "I read every article I could find. I just never admitted that I was looking." She looked down for a moment before continuing. "I confused accepting your career with losing my daughter. I see now those were never the same thing." I reached across the table and held one of the old newspaper clippings. "Why did you never tell me?" Tears gathered in her eyes once again, but this time they were accompanied by a small, peaceful smile. "Because I was too proud to admit I had been wrong." Every year that passed made apologizing feel more difficult than the year before. My father quietly joined us carrying 3 cups of coffee. He looked at both of us before smiling with visible relief. "This house has needed this conversation for a very long time." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking honestly instead of carefully. We laughed over childhood memories, acknowledged painful ones without arguing about them, and allowed uncomfortable truths to exist without turning them into fresh wounds. No miracle erased 2 decades overnight. Trust did not suddenly become effortless. But for the first time in years, every word pointed us in the same direction instead of pulling us farther apart. Several months later, I received an invitation to speak during a community program welcoming families whose sons and daughters had recently entered military service. I accepted without giving it much thought. When I arrived, I discovered another surprise waiting backstage. My mother had volunteered to participate on the parent discussion panel. She looked nervous, but when she saw me, she smiled with quiet confidence instead of uncertainty. During the event, one anxious mother asked the panel how parents learn to accept a path they never expected for their children. My mother paused before answering. "I spent too many years believing love meant guiding my daughter toward the future I wanted. Looking back, I think love sometimes means walking beside someone while they build a future you do not completely understand." I missed precious moments because I confused agreement with support. If I could relive one day, it would not be the day my daughter received her medal. It would be the moment I chose to remain seated when everyone else stood. That was the day I finally understood what standing beside someone truly means. I felt tears gathering in my own eyes as the audience applauded, not because she praised me, but because she had finally found the courage to tell the truth about herself. After the program ended, she walked toward me through the crowd. This time there were no cameras, no reporters, no ceremony, and no medals. She simply wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "I am proud to be your mother." Somehow those 7 words carried more weight than every award hanging inside my office. The Silver Star recognized one chapter of my life. My mother's embrace quietly healed another. Closing reflection: perhaps some of the deepest distances inside a family do not begin with anger but with expectations that quietly grow louder than understanding. This story reminds us that people can spend years loving one another while still struggling to truly see each other. There are moments when an apology cannot erase yesterday, yet it can gently change the direction of tomorrow. Sometimes healing arrives through one dramatic event, but more often it grows through honest conversations, patient listening, and the willingness to admit that our perspective may have been incomplete. There is something deeply hopeful about discovering that even after years of silence, a relationship can still find its way back to kindness one sincere step at a time. If this story made you think about someone important in your own life, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. If you found yourself in Rachel's or Diane's place, what conversation would you have wanted to begin, and what would you hope the other person finally understood about your heart?